Yeah, one of those important ones, like I said, is I'm a mom, which is a big deal for me. They're great. Anyway, thank you, and thank you, Patty, and thank you everyone who came here to listen to me present a little bit about principles of transcendental leadership. A little bit of background to the story, in a sense, is that I was in business. I was a pretty successful realtor, Seattle to Brentwood and so on in LA, and then Montecito. And in 2008, when everything tanked, I lost everything. And in my attempt to figure out what to do with my life is when I went back to school and wanted to get a master's degree in consciousness studies and maybe someday a PhD in consciousness studies, because I've always been fascinated with the unseen world and had read tons, and like Patty said, you know, I've been a meditator for a really long time and so on, so I've always been interested in this. So when I finally finished all the master's courses, which there were like 20 courses ranging from quantum physics, spiritual psychology, transpersonal psychology, wisdom traditions of the world, philosophy from Greece to Kantian to Emerson and so forth. I mean, I was really, you know, and 3 papers per class, so that was like 60 papers. My, you know, head was spinning. But then I had to go meet with the president and of the school and the dean of administration. They're like, well, what do you want to do your thesis on? And I'm like, well, I could do it on sacred space, you know, thinking, well, that'll be a breeze. And then I said, I have this other notion, because when I was starting to think about it, there was this idea becoming more and more bubbling to the surface called conscious leadership. And I thought, well, that's really interesting to me. However, because I had done all this work and studying of more things along, so you could call it transcendental or transcendent lines, that I had this just out of the blue thought about transcendental leadership. And they said, why don't you do it on that? And I went like, yay, and then went home and went, bah. You know, what am I going to do? I don't know the first thing here. I have to like start from the beginning. And that's kind of how that got started. You know, I went not too long ago while I was working on it to our planetarium here at the Natural History Museum, and I don't know when the last time you've been there, but I had this incredible experience when I was in the little planetarium, and you get this little, play or story or what have you, show, and to realize that we're such a speck. I mean, not just that our planet's a speck, but it's a speck of a speck of a speck of a speck of a speck. And I got to thinking about this glorious planet and all the forces that came together to create life, like the atmosphere and water, and then before you knew it, there were plants and animals that have evolved into these creatures that we are, that can be self-reflective and conscious and creative and love and so forth. And I thought to myself, how come I don't get up every morning and just be, yes, like, yes, I'm having this experience, because 20 years I'm in the dirt, it's all over. I don't care what Sean's, you know, afterlife thoughts might be, but, you know, in a couple generations, my sons, grandchildren, you know, nobody gives a dippity-doo, Sean, that you were here. So, what did I think about? When I thought about that, I thought, well, I should be having as much fun as possible. I should be loving as much as possible. I should be living full out as much as possible. I should be as engaged as much as possible. And some of those kinds of, that thinking process kind of pulled me into wanting to try to create something different, talk about something in a new way that I thought was really meaningful and important. So that's kind of how I got started here. I don't know what thank you. All right, So I don't know if you're familiar with Willis Harman, but Willis Harman was one of the founders of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He's gone to heaven now, but he said here, we're living in one of the most fundamental shifts in history, a change in the actual belief structure of Western and global society. No economic, political, or military power can compare with the power of a change of mind. And this is when I think about consciousness. By deliberately changing our images of reality, people are changing the manifest world. And I don't know how many of you are proponents of the notion that we create our own reality, but I am. Intentionally or unintentionally. We're huge participants individually and in a collective field. And back to the planetarium, our world is this, I feel, huge holographic universe. And in the essence of it is this universal intelligence. And I'm going to use the term universal intelligence every once in a while, but at the same time you can call it source or God or divine wisdom, you know, depending on what your particular sense about that might be. And here I think Willis Harman is saying that everything, like I say, is in relationship with everything. That there's one all-encompassing consciousness, one holographic mind that I call universal intelligence. And I think that it's connected to the whole, it touches the whole, is holistically connected to the whole, and affects the whole. We and the entire cosmos are part of this universal intelligence. And today, in terms of transcendental leadership and in leadership in general, our world and humanity's view of reality in general is increasingly fast-paced and complicated. It's complex, it's chaotic. There's so much going on. We've got technologies of communications around the nation, around the world. Even the most emotionally stable person is overwhelmed. So I think we need to broaden our perspectives and our worldviews. So this is why I feel we need a fundamental shift in how we perceive ourselves, our reality, and the life experience that we're manifesting, and how can we participate and take control. Control is maybe not the right word. It could even be surrender to being a co-creator in our world. So as Willis Harman tells us, people are awakening and they're beginning to embrace this new worldview, one which includes ancient ways of knowing and being with contemporary knowledge and global interconnection. And I think that this evolving awakening and awareness is critical. So I invite you to become more aware of this notion, more aware of your thoughts and choices. This process of becoming more aware starts with the individual's awakening because, as you know, you are the leader in your own life. This is another appropriate time to acknowledge Patty because we know her to be an extraordinary leader and is clearly becoming a transcendental leader as well. And thank you all for the opportunity to share these ideas. I'm honored and grateful to share them. So as we awaken to our inner reality and knowledge of universal intelligence within us, our exterior reality begins to shift and change as well. And as that shifts and change, an expanded consciousness occurs in the collective. And those leaders and individuals that currently create the strategies and systems of the larger framework of our organizations, this will begin to result in the day-to-day structure of the realities and strategies of those organizations to change as well. You know, when I began my research into leadership, I found hundreds of studies and articles because, you know, when you're writing a thesis, you have to document everything. Every sentence, every little notation, anybody who said this, that, or whatever. And I really worked hard at it. They kept saying, you know, that's too long. And I'm like, I can't help it. Okay. But they ended up really liking it. In any event, as I was researching all of this, you know, many of the writers and the speakers and scholars on leadership agree that self-knowledge is a fundamental element. But you know what's interesting is while they will say self-knowledge is a fundamental element to being a good leader, they almost never talk about self-knowledge as self-knowledge in the deeper inquiry within oneself. It's usually about personality and that kind of thing, the outer image and so forth. Not about looking deep within, looking at the conscious relationship that they might have in terms of the universal intelligence. And I think that it's this deeper dimension of the transcendental leader that represents largely, I'll wait for you. That's okay. These things happen. I think it's this deeper dimension of the transcendental leader that represents largely unexplored territory in traditional management theory, current management modalities, and the basic notions of leadership in general. I mean, imagine leaders leading from a place of transcendence. It's an exploration of leadership. It's radical, and yet a hopeful attempt to synthesize leading edge thinking, ancient wisdom, and the present conscious evolution in order to effect profound collective change currently needed in our world today. So as we begin to explore these principles that I'm going to talk about, this is important because at its foundation, transcendental leadership is a combined knowledge and inquiry delved from philosophy, ancient wisdom traditions, transpersonal psychology, and contemporary theories in the nature of reality and consciousness. So let's define how I define transcendental leadership. So the transcendent or transcendental is to rise above one's own perception of reality, to exist independent of the ego, the ability to discern the presence of spirit, discern the presence of the numinous, grace, and universal intelligence. Leadership is often defined as the process in which one individual influences a group in order to attain a common goal. Most ideas of leadership assert that a leader is someone who is committed to her cause, takes responsibility for moving the cause forward, and motivates and inspires her followers to the cause. A respected leader, we would agree, imbues an authentic, positive attitude and sense of self-esteem. Like Patty. In addition, ideally, she continues to self-actualize through progressive leadership training and personal spiritual life growth in an effort to develop herself and her abilities as an exemplary individual and role model. So to me, together, these elements define the conscious individual's lifetime journey, really, period. So let's look at these principles quickly, because I know we're, got a little strapped for time here. So let's start with philosophy. So we're told that the word philosophy comes from the Greek philosophia, meaning love of wisdom. And in Plato's Republic and the allegory of the cave, Plato addresses, among other questions, the selection and training of the leaders of the Republic. He says good leaders are, quote, lovers of wisdom, devoted as much to pursuing the vision of truth as they are to the execution of governmental affairs. They are people that pursue the good above all other goals, unquote. I think we can agree today that that's not necessarily what our leaders are doing, and when I think just of what's going on in Flint, I just am appalled, just appalled. Plato also says leaders must be educated, but not just in the manner of injecting new knowledge into minds that are already filled with what they believe to be knowledge. But, he says, by silently looking and deeply seeking the source of wisdom within oneself. Plato says again, quote, the philosopher leader whose dealings are with divine order himself acquires the characteristics of order and divinity. And in addition, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's one of my heartthrobs, and he was truly the center of American Transcendental movement, he said, I love this quote, he said, "Let man then learn the revelation of all nature and all thought to his heart, this namely, that the highest, capital H, the highest dwells within him, that the sources of nature are in his own mind. But if he would know that the great God speaketh, he must go into his closet and shut the door, as Jesus said. God will not make himself manifest to cowards. He must greatly listen to himself, withdrawing himself from all the accents of other men's devotions." Unquote. Along the lines again, in terms of philosophy, one of the fragments of one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus, who was considered to be the most famous and best philosopher that was before Socrates. He was the most creative and influential at the time. He says, I love this, "What is wise is one thing, that is to know the thought that directs all things." And I'm asserting that the thought that directs all things is universal intelligence, God, source. So now let's talk quickly about, these all tie together from my perspective in being a transcendental leader. Spiritual traditions. So when we look at sacred texts and scriptures and traditions of the world's predominant religions and doctrines of wisdom, they all reveal intellectual and spiritual journeys of the human spirit. The key themes found throughout these texts include loving thy neighbor as thyself, self-awareness, and a movement from outer divinity to understanding and accessing divinity within, all of which provide a construct for positive social action and leadership that contributes to the well-being of all. Early writings on the notion of the transcendent awareness carry a recurring theme on holographic unity found in the cosmos, all the natural world, and in many philosophical and spiritual teachings. One example, another fragment from Greek philosopher Heraclitus, is translated as, "I searched my nature," with statements analogous to the Buddha when he said, "I am awake." And if you're familiar with the story, is Buddha was teaching, and in his early ministry, a group of followers came to see him because they'd heard about him. And they were very impressed with his teaching, and they said, "Are you a saint?" And Buddha said, "No." "Are you a god?" And Buddha said, "No." He said, "Well, who are you?" And he said, "I am awake." This story is Buddhism's definition of realization and enlightenment, that to be fully awake is to be fully present. And Heraclitus searched his nature and found the same universal intelligence. Buddha's enlightening emerged as a direct response from his human experience of searching his own nature. These are the numinous moments of mindfulness and presence that Muhammad expressed when he said, "Wherever you turn, there is the face of God. Be it a tree, be it a star, be it a person." Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within." They're teaching us that universal intelligence, God and spirit, the transcendent, is everywhere. We just have to recognize it. So let's quickly talk now about transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal psychology is a fairly new school of psychology that integrates the spiritual and transcendent aspects of the human experience within the framework of modern psychology. Transpersonal psychology might loosely be called the psychology of spirituality and of those areas of the human mind which search for higher meanings in life and which move beyond the limited boundaries of the ego to access an enhanced capacity for wisdom, creativity, love, and compassion. It honors the existence of transpersonal experiences and is concerned with their meaning for the individual and their effect upon behavior. You may be familiar with William James, Carl Jung, and Abraham Maslow, who were some of the few psychologists that played a kind of a pioneering role in transpersonal psychology. So science and the essential nature of consciousness. I don't know if you're familiar with Professor Dr. Margaret Wheatley, who's written a number of books on leadership and organizations. She writes in one of her books, if nature uses certain principles to create infinite diversity, it's highly probable that those principles apply to human organizations. There's no reason to think that we are the exception. This shift towards participatory leadership and management may be rooted in our changing perspectives of the organizing principles of the universe. New scientific systems theories are emerging that note that the ecological worldview is shifting from the parts to the whole. Living systems, including organizations, are not assemblages of their parts, but are growing and constantly in the process of evolving and becoming. This part is a holographic element in an inseparable web of interconnection and relationship. This includes whether it's a subatomic particle to the cosmos. It's all connected. And John Gardner, who's a professor at Seattle University, he writes an article titled Transactional, Transformational, and Transcendental Leadership. He says, the essential nature of matter, according to the particle wave metaphor, is the essence of living things, the interconnectedness, unified field, and web of relationship. So what we're saying here is that the essential nature of matter and the cosmos, as explained by the wave-particle theory metaphor, lies in interconnection. And it is this web of relationship and consciousness which is the essence of all living things. Interconnectedness is the opposite of separateness. The idea that we're self-contained individuals. And since most of the major organizations, systems, and institutions of the Western world, like materialistic science, our economy, our political structure, our judicial system, our education, are based on the assumption that the world is composed of separate particles. The idea of this interconnectedness kind of rattles the Western worldview. So if we can consider the notion that our reality is a self-induced fiction, but we're all in agreement with it, is the reality creating us, or are we creating it? Most people think that they're participating in a reality already in static existence, rather than a reality which is something they're manifesting, even if unintentionally. So let's talk about some of the practices and guidelines that an individual can take a look at in terms of raising their awareness. Do you think that there's moments or circumstances that are opportune to propelling you into a new and transformative mindset and being? One attuned to the flow of the universal intelligence, imbuing the leader in her worldview and leadership capacities? If we were to earnestly study the Bhagavad Gita, if you're familiar with that, it's ancient Hindu scripture, Buddha's time sitting under the Bodhi tree, or Christ's 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, or Nelson Mandela's experiences in prison, we'd find nuggets of shared truth, such as the profound learning that is found in deep silence and deep listening to the voice within. Scientific studies show that certain discipline practices kept up over time have been shown to produce changes that provide the practitioner with greater levels of awareness, emotional balance, and deep knowing. And these practices include forms of meditation, time in nature, contemplation, yoga, and qigong, among many others. And I'm just putting some basic ones here because I think it's important to understand that there are a lot of paths, if you will. For example, there's many forms of meditation. Of course, mindfulness meditation is somewhat flavor du jour, but Eckhart Tolle would say mindfulness meditation just is focusing and concentrating on something or the things that come up, such that oftentimes people sort of, well, I can't focus, I can't keep, well, to some others, say in Transcendental meditation or in Vipassana, it's more effortless. And the idea is not to beat up on yourself because you're not doing it correctly a certain way. But regardless of that, meditation, I believe, is one of the most essential tools in the toolbox of any kind of transcendental leadership capacities. Some kind of form of contemplation and meditation. But at the same time, nature, and I don't think any of us would disagree that nature is a huge place for us to find the spiritual, if you will. You've probably known someone who, went to church one morning and, they tried really hard to have, a great spiritual experience, and they came home and got their hiking clothes on or their surf gear out, and off they went to the mountains or out to the surf and went, oh, whoa, that's where they find their, what I call peak experience, P-E-E-K experience. It can be in nature. When I talk about yoga, I'm talking about true Yoga Sutras, the deep study of yoga. Not to say that there aren't parts of Qigong that are like yoga. The body is another path, whether it's music, dance, art. For some people it's literature, and so on. So when I talk about these practices and guidelines, the point being, discover what resonates with you. Discover what helps you find some kind of a sensibility with your own spiritual awareness, because it's not necessarily evident in ordinary consciousness. So, one of the things I want to do here is I want to play a video, and I might need a little help, and then after the video I'm going to just say a few more things and then open it up to questions. So you're going to help me get that started. Okay, great, thanks. The video's about 4 minutes and a couple seconds. Maybe you are familiar with this fellow.
The world is coming to an end. The air is polluted, the ocean is contaminated, the animals are going extinct, the economy is collapsed, education is shot, police are corrupt, intelligence is shunned, and ignorance rewarded. The people are depressed and angry. We can't live with each other, and we can't live with ourselves, so everyone's medicated. We pass each other on the streets, and if we do speak, it's meaningless robotic communication. More people want 15 seconds of pain than a lifetime of meaning and purpose, because what's popular is more important than what's right. Ratings are more important than the truth. Our government builds twice as many prisons and schools. It's easier to find a Big Mac than an apple. When you find the apple, it's been genetically processed and modified. Presidents lie, politicians trick us. Race is still an issue. So is religion. Your God doesn't exist. My God does, and He is all loving. If you disagree with me, I'll kill you. Or even worse, argue you to death. 92% of songs on the radio are about sex. Kids don't play tag and play twerk videos. We have
Transcendental leadership shifts us away from the old paradigms of leadership models into a new leadership model, highlighting interconnection and wholeness. We know that the complex problems of today will not be solved by a consciousness that created them. Transcendental leadership offers us a new model to provide leadership that can contribute to the evolution of the world, where the conscious awareness of all humanity is developed for the betterment of all. I don't know if you're familiar with David Bohm. He was an American scientist who's been described as one of the most significant theoretical physicists of the 20th century, and who contributed innovative and, at the time, unorthodox ideas to quantum theory, neuropsychology, and the philosophy of mind. He explains, quote, "Yourself is actually the whole of mankind. The past is enfolded in each of us in a very subtle way. If you reach deeply enough into yourself, you are reaching into the very essence of mankind. When you do this, you will be led into the generating depth of consciousness that is common to the whole of mankind, and that into it. The individual's ability to be sensitive to that becomes the key to the change of mankind. We are all connected. If this could be taught, and if people could understand it, we would have a different consciousness that would change the world." Unquote. So, what can we do now? And I